Okay, we're recording.
Okay, so I've got all the links that I'm going to reference, and some of them I'll actually go to, but some I'm just going to reference.
Also, before you introduce Kirstin, Marianne, would you tell everybody everybody has control of their microphones, so ask everybody to mute. Thank you.
Yeah, what happened, Donna, was it became a hybrid thing of my research and some of these talks I'm doing for the big read, which I have PowerPoints for. So I have some big texty pages, Marianne, that come from my research, and Donna said that's a lot of text, but it's okay.
Some people try to read it and then they don't listen, and
Yeah. I'm not, yeah, design is not my best thing. I'm pleased to be bringing a PowerPoint to this event.
I should do a PowerPoint for faculty. PowerPoint workshop for faculty.
Yeah, that I actually
Honestly, I would go to that. I'm so
would
bad
too.
at them.
Oh, maybe I'll do
We
that.
tried having chair candidates in geography, and the one on Monday, her PowerPoint was like so good. I would have no idea where to start.
Well, I'm putting that on my list of things to do for the fall, not any.
You know what? You don't need any more things on your list. You can take it off.
That's true.
I'm taking some other things off, like Research and Creative Achievement Week. I think 10 years is enough.
Yeah.
It's killing me right now. No, I shouldn't say it that way. I love doing it. It's just gotten too big for me.
I think your point that 10 years is enough is true. 10 years is enough.
Of hurricane conferences, 10 years of Research and Creative Achievement Week. I'm done.
Holly, did you
It's 1 o'clock. So
books coffee mug?
Oh, cool.
Birchbark. I got that one year at the Native American Lit Conference. I still haven't made it to Birchbark Books, but I was just telling, we're reading Louise Erdrich in my class right now, and I was telling them about Birchbark Books, and
that's
I didn't
good.
realize that it's my favorite coffee mug. I didn't realize I was using it.
I like that.
I'm going to turn it over to Marianne because we're at 1 minute after 1.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. I think I know most of you, but for those I haven't met before, I'm Marianne Montgomery. I'm the chair of English, and I'm here to introduce Dr. Squint. But I'm also here to introduce something else. So this event, as you know, is part of Gender to a T, a very long-running and successful series of monthly colloquia hosted by the Gender Studies program that never fail to educate and inspire. And so I'm glad to be here today to introduce Dr. Squint. And I'm also going to tell you about the other series of which today's presentation is a part. The NEA Big Read Community Read of U.S. Poet Laureate Joy Harjo's book, An American Sunrise. With funding from the National Endowment for the Arts and partnership from a great team of people and organizations, including Kirstin, today's speaker, we've distributed nearly 650 free copies of the book in the community over the past 5 weeks. And we've held a series of events for all ages, lectures like this one, book discussions, a film screening, a concert, a hands-on pottery tutorial, writing workshops, all focused on the book and on Indigenous cultures and lives today more broadly. The Big Read series will culminate in Joy Harjo herself reading at ECU next week. So if you don't already have it on your calendar, mark your calendar. This is really exciting to have the Poet Laureate here on campus. It's March 30th, that's next Wednesday, 1 week from today, 7 p.m. in the Black Box Theater in the main campus Student Center. Free and open to the public, but we're expecting a big turnout, so get there early to claim your seat. We'll have validation stickers for free parking in the Student Center garage if you want to park right there. I've put a link to the Big Read website where you can learn more about the project and about Harjo's reading in the chat. Before introducing Dr. Squint, I'd like to share ECU's Indigenous Land Acknowledgement. We acknowledge the Tuscarora people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and live, and recognize their continuing connection to the land, water, and air that Greenville consumes. We pay respect to the 8 state-recognized tribes of North Carolina: Coharie, Eastern Band of Cherokee, Halawa Saponi, Lumbee, Meherrin, Occaneechi Band of Saponi, Saponi, and Waccamaw-Siouan, all nations and their elders past, present, and emerging. Now I'll introduce Dr. Kirstin Squint. Dr. Squint is Associate Professor of English and is also serving in her final year as Harriet College's Witcher Distinguished Professor in the Humanities. She has published and lectured widely on Native American literatures and cultures and U.S. multi-ethnic literatures, particularly in the Southeast. I'll just mention a couple of her recent books today. Hot Off the Presses, Conversations with Leanne Howe, which Dr. Squint edited and to which she contributed one new interview, was just published last month by the University Press of Mississippi. In 2020, Dr. Squint published the co-edited collection Swamp South's Literary and Cultural Ecologies with Louisiana State University Press. Today, she'll be speaking on The Role of Water in Joy Harjo's An American Sunrise, which is part of her In Progress book project. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kirstin Squint.
Thank you, Marianne, and thanks to the Gender Studies program and the GENS Executive Council for having me, and to all of you for coming. So as Marianne pointed out, this talk is a part of the larger Big Read series of events. And so even though I've come sort of in the traditional way of Gender to a T with an in-progress research project, I also wanted to share some of the things that I've been doing at some of the events, the Big Read events where I've been speaking. So before spring break, I spoke to the Lifelong Learning Program about Joy Harjo's An American Sunrise, which is the subject of our Big Read. And then also tomorrow, I'll be speaking with the Pitt County Council on Aging. And so what I'm doing at those events, I do talk about some of the topics that come up in my research, which is specifically about the representation of water in southeastern Indian removal. And Joy Harjo's An American Sunrise is one of the texts that I talk about, but also in these talks, I am talking about other elements of the book. And so today, once I kind of get through the formal research part that I'm working on and seeking feedback on, I want to share some of the other, a few highlights from some of the conversations I've been having with groups in the community, and also my class that I'm teaching right now about Joy Harjo's An American Sunrise, to get us all excited and thinking about her being here a week from today. So originally, this chapter was called Water and Representations of Southeastern Indian Removal, which is pretty boring, quite frankly, and not that interesting. And last fall, I taught a graduate Native American literature course focused on sustainability in indigenous texts and sustainable, unsustainable environments. And after I kind of had one of those moments where, as you're engaging with students and thinking about your own research, I realized I needed to reframe the chapter. And so I'm now calling it Tribalography, Indigenous Futurism, and Water, retelling the story of the Trail of Tears. And I'll mention the word tribalography today. I need to really, it's one of the things I think I need to develop more in the chapter, but tribalography is a theory of Native American storytelling developed by Choctaw writer Leanne Howe, and it's kind of taken hold in the last 8 years or so in Native American literary criticism, as it's an idea about how Native people tell stories where they connect past, present, and future milieu, and it's really about connecting cultures and times, and there's more to it, but that's probably the most concise way I could talk about it in terms of Joy Harjo's An American Sunrise. So I'm going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint, and I also, at some point, I'm going to go out and look at a couple of different websites. So let me do that, and then I'll get started with the presentation. Okay. So this is just kind of general information for folks who might not be familiar with Joy Harjo. I promise I won't read all of this text on this page. But I wanted to have this up so that if you weren't familiar with her work, you could have, there'd be some background information about her. And I'm going to start my paper, and then I'll get into some slides that are specific to the research that I'm talking about. But one thing I would note about her biography is that she is the first Native American Poet Laureate of the United States, and she is only the second Poet Laureate to hold the position for 3 years. So we're lucky to bring her to ECU on the end of her 3rd year as Poet Laureate. And An American Sunrise was a 2020 Oklahoma Book Award winner. And I will be also mentioning her just out memoir that came out in the fall of 2021, Poet Warrior, which I'm teaching my class right now, my intersectional feminisms class. I also dropped a link in the chat that will take you to her Poet Laureate project featuring a sampling of work by 47 Native Nations poets. It's an interactive story map, and it's really cool, and it's the first link that I dropped. So you can go on that and you can scroll over a particular dot on the map and it'll tell you about that poet. And so it's a really neat, fantastic, really cool poetry, interactive digital humanities project. So I'll go ahead and get started on the research, presenting the research part of my presentation today. And again, this is from a chapter that broadly talks about representations of water and Indian removal. And so I'm going to give you some of the introductory material and some of the concluding material to the chapter, and then the section on Joy Harjo's novel. So I'll reference some of the other texts for context. For the last 11 years, I have lived in North Carolina, home to one federally recognized tribe, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, and 7 state-recognized tribes, including the Lumbee and Hollywood-Saponi. In that time, I've taught several variations of classes that focus on Southeastern Indian literature, including some that drill down on the history of Indian removal. I was once cautioned by a fellow scholar who urged me not to let the Trail of Tears be the story that my students learned about Indigenous Southeasterners. And I understand that perspective in the face of sustained threats to tribal sovereignty. And yet, the longer I teach Native representations of Indian removal, the more I see how ignorant most of my students are of this complex and horrific history. I've even had some non-Native students proudly share that they have walked the trail, meaning they have visited somewhere on the North Carolina section of the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail, part of the National Park System that threads through 9 states. I've continued to teach stories related to Southeastern Indian removal because of this point made by historian Claudio Sant in his 2020 monograph, Unworthy Republic, The Dispossession of Native Americans and the Road to Indian Territory. There has been no reckoning with the conquest of the continent, little serious reflection on its centrality to the rise of the United States, and minimal sustained engagement with the people who lost their homelands. In the Southeast, this history seems to be even more obfuscated because removal shored up the power of those settler colonial states that would become the Confederacy. As historian Theda Perdue notes, removal served to solidify a biracial South and reinforce white power long after the Trail of Tears. Fictional texts that I have used alongside discussions of the history of removal in my literature classes include Leanne Howe's Shellshaker, Diane Glancy's Pushing the Bear, a novel of the Trail of Tears, Blake Hausman's Writing the Trail of Tears, and Joy Harjo's An American Sunrise. I try to stress to my students the decades-long period of voluntary and forced removals and the way they impacted discrete tribal nations in the Southeast. In addition to the diversity of tribal experiences during the removal era, we've had conversations about the differing ways Native peoples physically experience deportation from their homelands. And deportation is a term that Claudio Sant talks about quite a bit in his book. In particular, I have noted that removal was a long, dangerous, and often deadly journey over land and water, including numerous rivers and the Gulf of Mexico. Water crossings have been of particular interest to my students because they subvert the most commonly told story about the Trail of Tears, the 1838 to 1839 overland journey of the majority of the Cherokee Nation during terrible winter conditions as depicted in Pushing the Bear. I taught my first class focused on literature of Southeastern Indian removal in the spring of 2016 as the Dakota Access Pipeline protest began to gain national media attention and the Lakota phrase, Mni Wichoni, water is life, and the No Dakota Access Pipeline hashtag became ubiquitous on social media. This cultural spotlight on the sacredness of water seemed yet another reason to focus on its role in the painful stories being told by contemporary Native writers about Indian removal. What does it mean for a tribe when a sacred element becomes a site of trauma? How have writers found ways to subvert the stories of suffering that have been repetitively told about the Trail of Tears as a means of survivance? These are the kinds of questions I've explored with my literature students. I'm also interested in the ways that very contemporary texts about removal use both content and form to resist this history and its multiply retold narratives of trauma through tribalographic and indigenous futurist approaches. In particular, Joy Harjo's tribalographic collection in American Sunrise juxtaposes past and present in an attempt to heal the wounds of removal, while Blake Hausman's indigenous futurist novel, Riding the Trail of Tears, juxtaposes past and future, representing water as a decolonizing force with the power to reverse history and make way for resistance to a narrative of genocide and domination. And I'm going to skip ahead to the part where I focus on Harjo's An American Sunrise. An American Sunrise is a tribalographic text, a collection of poetry, memories, and archival documents that tell the stories of Creek removal, southeastern returns, origins, mournings, and blessings. The book's prologue begins with an explanation of Andrew Jackson unlawfully signing the Indian Removal Act, which led to the deportation of thousands of southeastern natives. Harjo notes that there existed many trails of tears of tribal nations all over North America, of indigenous peoples who were forcibly removed from their homelands by government forces, connecting that experience to indigenous peoples who are making their way up from the southern hemisphere as a continuation of the Trail of Tears. The final line, "May we all find the way home," speaks to how the collection will not only be a tribute to her own Creek ancestors, but also a far-reaching and inclusive homage to the land itself, of which we are all a part, as seen in the final poem, Bless This Land. Following the prologue, Harjo includes a map of Creek removal with this caption, "This is only one trail." There were many trails of tears from the homelands of the Muskogee Creek Nation West, just as there were for the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminole, and many other tribal nations. And this map that I've included here that's in the front of Harjo's book is the specific map of the removal of her ancestors from the area around Talladega, Alabama. Harjo notes in the book's acknowledgments that this map comes from Christopher Havman's 2018 monograph, Bending Their Way Onward, Creek Indian Removal in the Documents. Havman's book contains a total of 15 maps of the routes taken from Alabama to Indian Territory by the Creeks from the period of 1827 to 1837. He organizes the maps and other archival documents contained in the book chronologically, divided into the following sections. Part 1, the voluntary emigrations, 1827 to 1836. Part 2, the forced removals, 1836. Part 3, the coerced relocations, 1836 to 1837. Part 4, the refugee removals, 1837. Part 5, the voluntary self-immigrations and reunification immigrations, 1831 through 1877. And one of the reasons I list all of these is just simply to make the point what a long and complex process removal was just for the Creeks. I mean, this is only one of the major southeastern tribes that were removed. The maps show how most of these removals were overland with some of the legs of the journey via riverboat. However, the transport of Creek prisoners, the forced removals, took place completely by water, down the Alabama River to Mobile, across the Gulf of Mexico, with stops in New Orleans, and then up the Mississippi and Arkansas rivers. Historian Grant Foreman also describes removal across the Gulf of Mexico by the Seminoles, several parties of which were forced to stop in New Orleans, confined to the barracks in Fort Pike, or at the new barracks as they awaited transport up the river. New Orleans isn't often thought of as a way station on the Trail of Tears, yet it was, and this fact adds weight to the mournful tone of Joy Harjo's poem, New Orleans, from her well-known collection, She Had Some Horses. The poem comments on the absence of indigeneity in the Gulf South city that has for so long embraced its colonial and antebellum histories. Harjo writes, "This is the South. I look for evidence of other creeks, for remnants of voices, or for tobacco-brown bones to come wandering down Conti Street, Royale, or Decatur." The poem also describes Creek revenge against DeSoto, whose murderous rampage against southeastern tribes has been documented by fiction writers such as Leanne Howe and Shellshaker, and historians such as Patricia Galloway and Choctaw Genesis. The persona of New Orleans speaks of ancestral memory. There are voices buried in the Mississippi mud. There are ancestors and future children buried beneath the currents stirred up by pleasure boats going up and down. There are stories here made of memory. The specific remembrance detailed in the poem is of De Soto's death and water burial, yet these stories made of memory could certainly also refer to ancient indigenous trading routes on the Mississippi or the wrenching dislocation of removal. An American Sunrise takes on removal directly with the story of Harjo's grandfather, Monowi Okfuski, a Red Stick chief who emigrated with Detachment 3 on September 17, 1836. Harjo notes that Detachment 3 was conducted to Indian Territory by Dr. R.W. Williams on behalf of the Alabama Emigrating Company. In bending their way onward, Haveman explains that the Alabama Emigrating Company was composed largely of land speculators, many of whom had cheated the Creeks out of their reserves. The Journal of Occurrences, maintained by Lieutenant Edward Dease, included in Haveman's book, tracked the journey of Detachment 3 from their departure from Talladega, Alabama on September 17, 1836, to their arrival at Fort Gibson on January 23, 1837. Detachment 3's was mostly an overland journey, but Dease spends a good deal of time documenting what occurs during its Mississippi River crossing, the preparations for which commenced on November 1st. That day began the operation for ferrying Indian horses and ponies across the Mississippi, and by November 6th, the majority of the 2,696 Creeks in the detachment and their belongings had been loaded onto boats. Dease notes that 2 of the chiefs have refused to go by water, as many of the Indians have a prejudice against steamboats, one of whom was Harjo's ancestor Monowi. It was decided that a group of Creeks led by Monowi and Tuscuna Hadjo would meet up with the rest of the detachment on the far bank of the White River in Arkansas, where the boats would land after journeying south on the Mississippi and then up the smaller tributary. The reunion of the detachment turned out to be a slow process that occurred at various points along the journey across Arkansas, but the people were finally completely reunited in early January in between Little Rock and Fort Gibson. The chief's prejudice against steamboats was well-founded, as evidenced by the story of Sinicha, which Harjo includes in a piece called Muskogee Morning Song in An American Sunrise. Sinicha was aboard the steamboat Monmouth, which sunk in the Mississippi River in October of 1837. Muskogee Morning Song is found poetry from an interview with Elsie Edwards in a 1937 issue of Indian Pioneer History. Harjo's piece focuses on the oral tradition embedded in Sinicha's story, her song of removal. I have no more land, I'm driven away from home, driven up the red waters. Let us all go. Let us all die together, and somewhere upon the banks we will be there. Edwards includes the heart-wrenching detail that Sinicha's song was sung by others on board the Monmouth when it sank. Haveman describes how the steamboat was traveling with 6 others up the Mississippi from New Orleans when it took a western route around Prophet Island just north of Baton Rouge, instead of taking the eastern route that it should have. Another steamboat crashed into it, causing the cabin to detach from the hull and the boat to sink. Approximately 300 of the 700 on board, mostly Creek refugees, died in the accident. According to Yvonne Lewis Day of the Baton Rouge Genealogical and Historical Society, most of the bodies of those who died in the crash washed ashore near Port Allen, which is across the river from Baton Rouge, and were buried in unmarked mass graves. These water crossings of Muskogee peoples in Harjo's An American Sunrise underscore the complex undertaking that was southeastern Indian removal. Boat voyages across the Gulf of Mexico were as much of a trail of tears as were the overland journeys, and New Orleans played as prominent a role as Memphis for Mississippi River embarkations. So that's the part of my chapter that's focusing on An American Sunrise, and I'll just share a little bit of the conclusion that I'm working on for the chapter before I move into some of the other information about An American Sunrise. My continued research into the history and implications of Indian removal has been inspired by my work with students in the Southeast who regularly demonstrate their interest in the subject and alarm at their own lack of knowledge. I have focused on water here because it is one way to subvert the narrative of a singular trail of tears by one southeastern tribe, the Cherokee, an overland journey that occurred in the winter of 1838 to 1839. A horrific story indeed, but one of many stories that can and are being told. As Haveman notes in his monograph on Creek removal, the abject misery of Indian removal is nearly impossible to convey in a monograph. The events are too big and the words too small to depict accurately the physical and emotional sufferings of those who experience this American tragedy. This history and its implications are also too big to convey during one college-level course, yet I continue to do so and urge other educators, particularly in the Southeast, to do so as well. To revisit Sant's point, we need a reckoning with the conquest of the continent, more serious reflection on its centrality to the rise of the United States, and enduring sustained engagement with the people who lost their homelands. This reckoning can begin in our classrooms as a form of acknowledgement of the history of our lands and of the indigenous peoples who maintain relationships with those lands. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears just a little bit. And so as I mentioned previously, I'm giving a couple of talks associated with the Big Read grant. And in those talks, I'm trying to, in addition to sharing my own kind of research and knowledge about Indian removal and the way that Harjo is using that history in this text, I'm also trying to introduce the text more broadly and kind of highlight some of the things that might be notable to readers. And so the first thing that I focus on is the title poem, An American Sunrise, which I call here an homage to Gwendolyn Brooks and Indigenous blues and jazz. And I have to apologize because I've kind of pulled together a PowerPoint that I've been using in different ways. And this morning, typically when I'm working with groups with this book, they have the book in front of them, and I realized you might not have the book in front of you. So I didn't have a copy of An American Sunrise in the PowerPoint, so I quickly snapped a photo and included it on this page, and I realized it's a little bit curvy, but anyway. But you need to be able to see it next to Gwendolyn Brooks's poem, We Real Cool. And so when we look at this poem together, when I'm with students or doing some of these talks, we first look at Gwendolyn Brooks's well-known poem, We Real Cool. And Gwendolyn Brooks is the first African-American writer to win the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry. She won it in 1949. And this poem is well-known because she does so much in such a small space. So I will just take a moment, bear with me here, and I will read it. And I will say I got to see Gwendolyn Brooks read this poem when I was an undergrad long ago in Illinois. She came down from Chicago, and I'll never forget that. We real cool, the pool players, 7 at the Golden Shovel. We real cool. We left school. We lurk late. We strike straight. We sing sin. We thin gin. We jazz June. We die soon. And so when I look at this poem, alongside An American Sunrise, I ask my students to read the last word in each line of Harjo's poem. And if you do that, you see it reads, we strike straight, we sing, we sin, we thin, gin, we jazz, June, we. So she's obviously playing with Gwendolyn Brooks's poem. It's set in it's set in a pool hall. The poem is. There are conversations about jazz. There are conversations about colonialism. There are conversations about drinking. And so she's obviously doing a lot of playing with the theme of Brooks's poem. And so I've dropped a link in the chat for you to go to a website. And I'm actually just going to pop out of my PowerPoint here for a minute and go to this page that I shared with you. If I would be better at technology, I could have possibly gotten this to play during this PowerPoint, but I couldn't. So at some point, listen to Joy Harjo and her band play An American Sunrise, because it's such a great experience to hear that poem as a song. And of course, she's a saxophone player, and I'm sorry to tell you she won't be playing her sax next week at ECU. We just found that out. But anyway, listen to her sing the song because it's really interesting. But I also wanted to go to this website to share this information with you about the poem as Joy Harjo talks about how it came to be. She says that it was written first in response to a call for Golden Shovel Poems, a form initiated by Terrence Hayes to honor Gwendolyn Brooks's poetry, and she was contacted for the Golden Shovel anthology for which she wrote this poem. She said, at the same time, I was writing a musical that includes Muskogee and indigenous peoples in the origin story of blues and jazz. We'd been disappeared from the story, yet there would be no blues or jazz without our contributions. Our tribal music is also pentatonic, polyrhythmic, features call and response, and we know how to swing. And so let me go back into the PowerPoint. I will also say about that particular point that so Harjo has written, and many indigenous, I just came back from a conference in New Orleans, an indigenous symposium, and folks, I've long heard folks talk about Congo Square, which is a place where enslaved Africans would come to dance on Sundays in New Orleans. And I've long heard folks talk about this, that was also a dance ground for green corn ceremony. And so it's long been a place that people have gathered in the place that becomes New Orleans. And so this is part of what Joy Harjo is talking about, I think, here, is that these call and response and all of these things that we think of as associated with jazz and blues are also in indigenous music. And so she's long been making a connection, and she herself is a jazz player. So also wanted to talk a little bit about some of the ekphrastic poetry in the book. And so I'm sharing with you information I share with students. So ekphrastic poems are, describe scenes, or they describe works of art. And in particular, in American Sunrise, Joy Harjo has a poem called Mama and Papa Have the Going Home Shiprock Blues, which is an ekphrastic poem that looks at several works by an artist, a Kiowa artist that she greatly admired by the name of T.C. Cannon. And she also has a couple of poems that are clearly tributes to him: Bourbon and Blues for T.C. Cannon, a brother of poetry and song, and Weapons, or What I've Taken in My Hand to Speak When I Have No Words, inspired by T.C. Cannon's images. But Mama and Papa Have the Going Home Shiprock Blues reference specific paintings that I wanted to share with you. And it's also worth stating that Joy Harjo was, she was sorry about that. She was a visual artist before she was a poet or a saxophone player. And so when she went to the Institute for American Indian Arts, she was which was at that time still a BIA school. It was a boarding school, and she went as a high school student. She was painting. She was a visual artist, and it was later that she began to write poetry, and even later than that she began to play music. So, but she's, as my students are telling me right now and writing about, they're so inspired by her creativity and the way that she works in so many forms. So I've shared a couple of, I put all of these links in the chat, by the way, if you want to go to these on your own, but I did want to share with you. So in An American Sunrise, Mama and Papa Have the Going Home Shiprock Blues is on page 37 of the book. And Shiprock, by the way, is a place on the Navajo reservation. There's a very well-known rock, they call it. It was called Shiprock by I lived about 40 miles south of Shiprock when I taught on the Navajo reservation many years ago. And it is, from the Diné or Navajo perspective, it is not a rock that looks like a ship. That is what, that was a colonial perspective. It's actually the side of a wing of one of the monsters that I can't remember both of their names. There were two, Holly probably can think of this, a Monster Slayer and Born for Water, I think, the hero twins of Navajo traditional stories. And anyway, this poem, though, is called Mama and Papa Have the Going Home Shiprock Blues, and it is actually, that is one of the paintings that we'll look at. So this particular image, Two Guns Arakara, is one of the paintings that Joy Harjo writes about. It is, she calls it Song 2 in An American Sunrise, and I'm just going to read it because it's very short. These are very short poems, but I thought it would be interesting for you to kind of see what she's doing with these poems and this imagery. Two Guns Arakara. The right hand knows what the left hand is dreaming. The left hand might be less sure of the absolute world, but it knows how to follow. Together, we have it. And there's another, and so these articles are really interesting about T.C. Cannon. He really changed Native American art, and he was a Vietnam War veteran, and he died very young. I think he was 32 when he died. This is the artist. He was a great fan of Bob Dylan, who he painted here, and Mama and Papa Have the Going Home Shiprock Blues is actually kind of a inspired by Dylan's work, and he actually wrote some song lyrics to go with it. This is the actual painting, Mama and Papa Have the Going Home Shiprock Blues. And one of the things that folks talk about with this painting is the way that you have two Navajo or Diné elders here in traditional clothing, and yet, there's sunglasses, and there's a contemporary look about it, and that was one of the things that, T.C. Cannon was doing in American Indian art. And so this is another poem right here. This is Soldiers, that Joy Harjo writes about, and it's Song 3 in her poem. And she writes, "We were ready to defend the land and the people against those who wanted what was not theirs to take. We were called heathen, but who is heathen here?" And so in this painting, you see the division. And this article talks about this, how divided Cannon felt about fighting in a war, one half being native warrior and the other the colonizing soldier who oppressed his people, how it felt to represent the United States in the Vietnam conflict. And then there's one on this website, there's one last painting. Oh no, sorry. We need to pop over here. And so this article again has several images of T.C. Cannon paintings, and we have some overlap. But this one, Joy Harjo also writes about in An American Sunrise, and this is called Three Ghost Figures, and that's on page 43. And she writes, "The past rose up before us and cried in the voices of the children who were dragged to Indian school and never returned. The present spoke up, and those who remembered how to listen could hear. We offered tobacco and paid attention to their stories. The future was a path through soldiers with Gatling guns and GMO-spoiled crops, motioning us to safety." And that, I think, is a really interesting interpretation of what's going on in this particular image. But again, that's, this kind of poetry, ekphrastic poetry, it's the way that the poet interprets, the piece of art. And so again, I'm just kind of quickly going through this. This is another thing that I talk about with students and also folks in the community that I've been talking to about this work. The other thing that I've been doing in these presentations is asking folks, what do you want to hear out loud? Which of these poems, is interesting to you? And a lot of folks are very interested in the poem Washing My Mother's Body, because Harjo didn't get a chance to sort of be with her mother, and so it's an imaginative kind of thing about washing her body after she died. Bless This Land, which is, I think, a pretty kind of well-known poem at this point because it's such a beautiful blessing for the land that is the United States, and it's an honest, kind of look at that. So what I tell, there's one more that I'm going to focus on here before we stop for Q&A, and I think I'm doing okay on time. But I do tell everyone right now, my favorite Joy Harjo poem is For Calling the Spirit Back from Wandering the Earth and Its Human Feet, which is just a beautiful poem. And it's a healing poem. And so I've dropped the YouTube link also in the chat for that poem as well. So if you'd like to listen to that, or if you're familiar with it, it comes from her book, Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings, which is, I think right now, my favorite collection of hers. But I wanted to talk just one last thing about a poem in An American Sunrise that is another tribute to an artist or a writer. And this one is A Refuge in the Smallest of Places for Emily Dickinson, one of the singers. And for all those, there's I think an error in the book, but I've put it I've quoted it as it is in the book. And for all those feeling on those ancient migration trails north for home. So I got very excited about this. I'm a huge Emily Dickinson fan myself, but I got excited because in recently teaching Poet Warrior, her new memoir, to my students in intersectional feminisms, Joy Harjo talks a lot about why she came to love Emily Dickinson. And so I wanted to share this with you. So on page 60 of An American Sunrise, she shares Emily Dickinson's I'm Nobody, Who Are You? And it's a short poem, so I'll read it. I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell. They'd advertise, How dreary to be somebody. How public, like a frog. To tell one's name, the livelong June, to an admiring bog. And then Joy Harjo writes underneath Dickinson's poem, Emily Dickinson was 6 years old when Manawi and his family began the emigration to the West. So she contextualizes Emily Dickinson's life within what is happening to her own people in terms of Indian removal at the time. But I also wanted to share with you the poem that she writes, A Refuge in the Smallest of Places, to Emily Dickinson, or inspired by Emily Dickinson. Someone sang for me, and no one else could hear it. When I had given up and made knife marks on my arm, or drank and gave myself away, or was given, someone sang for me, and no one else could hear it. When demons came with ropes and cages to take my children from me and imprison us, someone sang for me and no one else could hear it. Now I am here in the timeless room of lost poetry, gathering up the destroyed and forgotten because of the songs someone sang that no one else could hear but me. And so, on page 37 of Joy Harjo's memoir, her newest memoir, her first memoir was called Crazy Brave. This one has a lot more poetry and a lot more, there's a movement of poetry throughout Poet Warrior that's very interesting. But I also wanted to share with you why she became such a fan of Emily Dickinson, because it kind of comes back to the importance of poetry and why it is such a great honor for us to have the Poet Laureate coming to ECU. So she's, the context of what I'm reading is she's been talking about her parents and her parents had an abusive and dysfunctional relationship, and it impacted Harjo and her siblings a lot. It was the same that year. It was that same year I asked for books of poetry for my birthday. I was giving Louis Untermeyer's Golden Treasury of Poetry. It was there I first found the poet Emily Dickinson. As I perched that large book between my skinned knees, alone in my need to be alone, her voice reached out from the pages and made friends with me. I could hear her, though we were years, miles, landscapes, and cultures away from each other. I liked to read aloud to myself. I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. I was a nobody, hearing the voice of another nobody, both of us peering at each other from behind our knees. We bonded over our hiding places. Two nobodies equal one somebody. Emily's poems told me she too found herself with words. Poetry was a refuge from the instability and barrage of human disappointment. When I read and listened to poetry, I was out of the crossfire of my parents. I never knew when my father would come home, and if he did, what condition he would be in. My mother was in fury or tears as she left for work, sometimes 2 jobs, and then returned home to cook, clean, and care for her 4 children. Everything was coming apart, and I didn't know what was going to happen to us. There was talk of adopting us children out. There were too many of us, said my father. My mother would not let us go. I retreated to poetry. I disappeared into the music. Poetry lingered there with me. And when there was music and poetry, dance was not far behind. The dreaming realm worlds were growing dimmer and dimmer as there was no place for them in a world of school books, classes, and scientific knowledge. But with poetry, doors would open inside, even as I heard them slamming outside. And so I'm going to stop there and say, if you weren't already planning to do so, please come see Joy Harjo read at ECU next week. And I'm happy to take any questions or comments that you have.
I have a question, if it's okay. When I was rereading the poem "An American Sunrise" for the college book club last week, I noticed that the version that's in the book is a little bit different than the version of the poem that was originally published in Poetry Magazine. It's on the Poetry Foundation's website. And the difference is in the last lines. I'll drop the link in the chat, but the original version of the poem, or the originally published version, has 2 additional lines. So the one in the book ends on "We are still America, we," but then the one from Poetry Magazine in 2017 keeps going. "We know the rumors of our demise. We spit them out. They die soon," which, that echoes the "we real cool," the even more with the "they die soon" versus "we die soon." But it also really, to me, changes the tone of the poem a lot from what's in the book. So I didn't know if you were aware of this change or if you had thoughts about it.
It's so funny that you say that, because when I did it in class, in my current class, because I'm not teaching an American Sunrise in my current class, we read the version on the Poetry Foundation page. So I didn't even think about it at all. And in that point, when we talked about it in class, we said, well, an American Sunrise and the rumors of Indigenous people's demise is dying soon. It's hopeful, right? But yeah, You're right. It totally changes the poem. So I don't know why.
I mean, I don't
It's
know if it
different.
totally changes it, but it definitely it's very different to end on that we that doesn't have a verb.
Right.
Um, so
Yeah. Yeah, that's so funny because I didn't, yeah, I didn't realize that. But now that you say it, yeah, for sure. I think that'd be a great question for Joy Harjo. Other questions or comments?
Um, Thanks, Kirsten. I already learned a lot from just what you explained, and I've been enjoying reading the poems. And I like the poem "By the Way" for Adrienne Rich, and I don't know what her influence from Adrienne Rich was, but I also think that's got a lot of interesting water imagery in it, talking about the Chattahoochee River, which of course runs through Georgia, and also the dam, kind of the whole image of breaking the dam and so forth. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that poem or information about it.
I don't, but I was just trying to remember if in Poet Warrior, if she talked about Adrienne Rich, there's this beautiful section where she talks about her relationship with Meridel Lesueur. Is anyone familiar with this writer? Um, and I feel like in that section at one point she maybe talked about Adrienne Rich, but I think well, and there's a whole section in Poet Warrior about teachers. She also talks about Audre Lorde and the way that she impacted her and the relationship that they had. But no, I'm sorry, I don't have any information about Adrienne Rich. What page is that poem on it in an American
It's on
Sunrise?
it's on page 101.
Oh yeah. Mhm.
It's a really powerful poem. I don't fully understand it, but
Mhm.
it's got a lot going on in it.
Yes, we are going to have to ask Joy Harjo about that as well.
And I did not know that she was also a jazz musician and had been a visual artist. I think that's really interesting.
Yes, and in fact, years ago, she had this band, Poetic Justice. That's when I first learned about it. I have to show you all something. I'm sorry, actually, it might be on my bookshelf. Oh, it is. Okay. Okay. I'm going to show this to her next week. So I taught my first Native American Lit class 20 years ago at Coconino Community College in Flagstaff, Arizona, and it was the first Native Lit class there. And I bought this videotape, this VHS tape, and in it, her band, she plays with Poetic Justice, and I haven't been able to play this thing. So I want to show her. I want to show her this VHS tape. Um, but yeah, I, I'm not exactly sure how old she was when she started playing the saxophone, but I mean, I think she was in her maybe early 40s. It's not. That's one of the things I really admire is the way she just continuously, picks up and creates and in fact, in Poet Warrior, she talks about this. There's a Creek jazz musician that she started learning from in this teachers section when she decided to start playing. So anyway, this is a really good book, and it'll tell you a lot about kind of her development. Crazy Brave is also good, and I've taught that too. And it's really more about her early years. Although Poet Warrior starts in her childhood as well, but it's also a little more uh, episodic, I'd say. She focuses on really some specific episodes, like she was her second marriage. She married a pretty well known poet, but it was a very uh, tumultuous relationship, and she talks about that in depth, whereas she doesn't really mention it all in this. So they're kind of interesting because they're not really. I think she really consciously tried to trace her development as a poet. And at the beginning of the book, she calls herself, I think one of my students is in here or was for a little bit. She calls herself girl warrior or poet girl. I can't remember. I think it's girl warrior. And then she's trying to show her coming of age. I'm sorry, I got way far away from your comment, but
No, that's good.
So, are we Hi.
Hey.
It was a very wonderful talk, and I'm as also a poet, a jazz singer, a guitar player, and a painter. I would love to be able to even have some personal interaction. Is there going to be an opportunity for us to sit down with her and like
Um,
wine and diner or anything like that? Or
there are some small events, but they're very small
because they're very
her
small.
because of COVID and because of negotiations we've been doing with her agent. So I'm afraid there won't be a lot of interaction with her, and she's very concerned about COVID. So,
Yeah, I don't blame her. And the
but
other
I'd
thing is,
say,
well, the other thing is, I'd like to get my students involved in this, and aside, what kind of, do you have a poster you're sending out or,
yeah,
something
if you
like
go,
that?
Marianne dropped a link at the very beginning of the chat. If you go up to the top of the chat, it says english.ecu.edu/big read. It's got the events, and every event has a link on there. So yeah,
Perfect, perfect. Well,
yeah,
thank you so much. That was a lovely talk, and it was just, I love seeing pictures too, and hearing,
yes, thank you.
and hearing. Now, I would have loved to have heard some music too. So,
Go
next,
if you go. Well, actually, you know what? Well, there are a couple things. I'm going to find the link and I'll drop it in the chat to her website because it's really good. But my student has corrected me. Lee is here, and she said at the beginning of the memoir, she's girl warrior, and then as she develops and comes of age, she becomes poet warrior. But I'm going to pull Joy Harjo's website, which is really incredible. And it's become so since she's been poet laureate. But it's got music and interviews and books, and it's a really, really great resource. And I just had my students write about it last week because they all could get so much out of it. So I'm going to pull that up and drop that link in the chat as well.
thank you.
You're welcome.
Sue, I just sent you an email with information about the reading next week as well. But you can also follow the link in the chat. One thing I wanted to let you all know is that also because of COVID, Joy is not going to be doing a traditional book signing, but she is going to sign book plates that we'll have available, for free at the reading. So if you want to bring your copy of An American Sunrise or purchase one of her other books at the reading, you'll be able to get a signed book plate to put in it. So we're really sad that she's not able to do a traditional signing, but we also understand that this is one, it seems like she hasn't done a whole lot of in-person events and is sort of becoming, like we all are, figuring out what those look like with COVID.
Well,
Yeah,
thank you.
you're welcome. Yes, and someone else mentioned TC Cannon. I know a couple of you have. I think I learned of his work through her work, and he's just his work is so stunning and so important, really. And it's really a tragedy that he died so young. I don't think he was at the IA before her. They weren't there together or anything, but I think he was an artist that she admired as she was coming up. And, she was an activist, and she was involved in a lot of things in her youth, and knew a lot of Native folks really from all over the country, partly from going to IAIA at a young age, and also just traveling around and teaching at lots of different institutions and doing lots of different things over the years. Any other
My,
questions?
my students' next project is a political art project. They just finished one dealing with the pandemic, and their next one is to choose a social political. So this really ties beautifully in. I've got a lot of students, so hopefully I can get them there.
Yeah, I hope that you can. And one of the things I was thinking about a lot as someone who does work in indigenous literatures, one of the questions people will ask me from time to time is like, well, is it Native American, or is it indigenous, or is it American Indian? And it's an interesting question because, the terms have changed over the years. And when I taught on the reservation years and years ago, I had a high school student say to me, when did we become Native Americans? I thought we were Indians. And I had to say to her, she's a high school student. I said, it's an academic term, and what you call yourself in your community is who you are. That's and so anyway, at the end of Poet Warrior, Joy Harjo has a great, I love what she says here about language. This is in her notes. She says, I reluctantly am going along with italicizing non-English words. Our indigenous language preceded English. I considered rendering the English in italics and the Muskogee words in plain regular type style. Indigenous peoples within the boundaries of the United States use many terms for ourselves depending on generation, education, and geographical place. Generally, we use our tribal nations as identification, and as members within our nations, we identify by clan systems, tribal towns, moieties, and/or bands. The collective term for indigenous nations was and still is for some of us Indian, American Indian, and colloquially sometimes skins. The term Native American came into prominence out of the academic realm in the late 80s. I resisted it and prefer the term Native nations or indigenous or even just Native. And so I was thinking about the ways that, I tell students, if you know a specific tribal nation, use that, because, what this umbrella term does is it just turns into, this binary opposition between colonizers and colonized people. But at the same time, there are times when that grouping is effective. So then which term do you use, right? And so different people think differently about this. Different, indigenous intellectuals have different ideas about it. But I appreciated that as poet laureate, she is talking about language and she's trying to give us direction and asking us to think about those things.
Yeah, I just to talk about a parallel scenario. I was talking with Carol DeShiel's wife. We were having a conversation last year or the year before. I can't remember when it was. And I used the word African American. She said, I don't like that term. We're not from Africa. We use Black. But, so I think what I learned from that is to ask. How do you wish to be identified? I mean, we're all something. And if it matters, and if language matters to a person, then it's nice to ask.
That's right. Other questions or comments? I can tell you what I know about Joy Harjo, but there's lots more to learn. I will say my second favorite poem by her is called Surfing Canoes in Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings. And it's a very short poem, but I'm a stand-up paddleboarder, and it's kind of about the pleasure and the joy. For a long time, so she did talk more in Poet Warrior about the long time that she lived in Hawaii, about a decade, and didn't want to leave, and why she did ultimately leave. And she was she surfed canoes, and she did that regularly. And so it's this beautiful poem that kind of ties in love with this kind of experience on the water. And that's just my own I think she has many, many stellar poems, but that one kind of speaks to me on the topic of water.
Well, Kirstin, I just want to say thank you to you and Marianne and everybody who's worked so hard on this. I'm in a lot of community groups, and I've heard a lot of people talking about this and about the event. So, and especially members of our North Carolina tribal communities, who I think have just so greatly appreciated the outreach to them. And so I'm excited for her visit.
Yeah, and I'm just super impressed and excited for what Marianne has done with the grant, and it's been really fun to work with her, and also Marianne did a tremendous amount of outreach to communities, tribal communities, for that first event. And I think we're keeping those relationships. We're continuing to talk to folks, and so that's I think wonderful.
Well, any more questions? I think we have like 3 minutes left. Okay, well, we recorded this, so if people want to go back and see it again, we can do that. And I appreciate you attending this and giving us this talk. It was great. Thank you so much. And if we're finished, I will say goodbye.
Okay, thank you. Come
Thank
see
you.
Joy Harjo.
Bye.
Bye.